The Pope flew into New York City. And he arrives in New York City and he gets picked up by a limousine. Sure enough, who's driving the limousine? Max. Max is a nice Jewish young man, limousine driver, picks up the Pope, and they're on their way. And just a few minutes into the drive, the Pope turns to Max and says, "Max, can you do me a favor?" And Max says, "Sure, what is it?" And the Pope tells Max, "Max, you know something? I love driving cars. But wherever I go, they send me a limousine with the driver, and I can just never get behind the wheel anymore. Would you mind switching places with me?" And Max says, "Listen, with all due respect, I can lose my job if I do something like that. I can't let you drive the car." And the Pope says, "Please, we won't tell anybody. It's going to be fine. Just give me a few minutes behind the wheel. It's fine." And Max, under the pressure of the Pope's request, says, okay. And they switch places, and there's Max in the back seat, and there's the Pope driving the car. And it only took about 20 seconds before Max realizes that the Pope didn't just like to drive, he liked to race. And suddenly he accelerates, and that car is going at a speed of 80 miles an hour, and Max is holding on for dear life. Thank God, a cop picks up on them and with sirens comes right behind them, slows down the Pope, and brings him to a stop. The cop gets out of his car, comes over to the limousine. The Pope rolls down the window, and the cop is in for the surprise of his life. There in the front seat is sitting the Pope. He just pulled over the Pope. He can't imagine this. So he says, "Oh my gosh," he's all flustered. He says, give me a minute. And he runs back to his car and he radios in to his chief. And he says, "Chief, you won't believe it. You won't believe who I just pulled over." He says, "Who'd you pull over?" He says, "Oh my gosh, you won't believe it." He said, "Who was it? Was it the mayor?" He says, "Oh my God, the mayor." It wasn't the mayor. The governor. It wasn't the governor. Who was it? Oh my gosh, you can't believe who it was. Was it the president? He says, "No, it wasn't the president." The chief says, "Tell me, who was it?" He says, "I don't know, but the Pope is his driver." You see, in life, there are things that we choose. But there are many things that we don't choose. They're given to us, not by choice. They are given to us. And when they are given to us, we have then two choices. We have the choice of accepting it or resisting it. That's it. Those are the two choices. There isn't a single one of us in this room, there isn't a single Jew that was given a choice. We were born as a Jew. We were thrust into the inherent conflict that comes along with being a Jew. And we have a choice. And the choice is either to accept it or to resist it. Those are the two choices that we have. Not a single Jew since Mount Sinai was able to avoid this conflict. And neither can any one of us. Are we going to choose to accept that we are a Jew and what that means, or are we going to continue to resist it? Do I accept myself? Do I accept myself for who I am, or am I awaiting acceptance from the world around me? That is ultimately what this boils down to. I can't say I'm standing outside of it because I'm in it. Am I going to accept who I am, or am I going to seek the acceptance from the world around me? Where do we choose to get our Jewish identity from? It's either from within or it's from without. Either I accept the identity that God has given me, or I will perpetually, endlessly seek that acceptance from the world around me. When I take a morning flight and I have to drive to the airport and get up pre-dawn, and I arrive in the airport when it's light outside, I still have to pray my morning prayers. And every single morning I put on a tallis, I put on tefillin, and I pray to God. And there I am in the airport. And I have the conflict. Am I going to pray or am I not going to pray? And yes, I always choose the choice of praying. And I put on my towels and I put on my tefillin in a hustling, bustling airport. And yes, I feel the conflict. Of course I feel the conflict of all of the people looking at me as if I'm some strange individual and as I'm praying to God. At those moments, at that moment, that's when I have to make a choice about whether my identity comes from within, who am I and what am I going to do now, or from without. No, I am seeking acceptance from everyone else, and therefore I'm not going to do this thing which looks strange to them. When I have to walk from my home here with a black hat on, and I know that 90% of the cars driving down the street are going to slow down to look at this strange phenomenon in Newtown, Pennsylvania. I am feeling the conflict. Of course I'm feeling the conflict. And it's at that moment that I have to make a choice of whether I'm going to accept who I am and let my identity come from within, or seek acceptance from everyone around me and strip myself of what I know, who I know I truly am. When we have to take off a Jewish holiday and we have to go to our boss and say, it's Rosh Hashanah, it's Yom Kippur, it's Sukkot, whatever holiday, and I need to take off, and the boss is going to look at us with those strange eyes and say, I never heard of that holiday. Yes, it's at that moment that we feel a conflict, and it's at that moment that we are demonstrating to ourselves where we get our identity from. Whether I am accepting myself or whether I'm seeking acceptance from another. When I'm going to a business meeting or a company party and it's not kosher, and I'm making that choice of whether I'm going to say, I keep kosher, I can't eat the food. Why aren't you eating? Because I'm a Jew and I keep kosher. Oh, you're going to feel the conflict. Of course you're going to feel the conflict. You can't avoid the conflict. The question is how you are going to respond to that conflict. Are you going to accept who you are, or are you going to seek the acceptance of those around you? This is the unavoidable conflict that every single one of us has, and the question is what choice we are going to make. The Mishnah in Ethics of Our Fathers teaches us, be bold as a leopard, light as an eagle, swift as a deer, and strong as a lion, to do the will of your Father in heaven. And the great mystical commentator, the Maharal of Prague, asks the question, what is the difference between being bold as a leopard and strong as a lion? And he explains, being strong as a lion is an external demonstration of strength. Being bold as a leopard is an inner demonstration of strength. Being bold as a leopard is when someone demonstrates that they are willing to live without fear of public opinion. That's boldness. That's being bold as a leopard. That is saying that I am not going to spend my life seeking acceptance from you. I am going to seek my own acceptance, to accept who God made me to be. This is the reason why the first law, the very first law in the Code of Jewish Law, before all of the laws listed in the Code of Jewish Law, the very first one, it tells us, Al yevosh mipnei hamaligim. Don't be ashamed before those who mock you. Because if you're ashamed before those who mock you, is it even worth studying all of the other laws? What are you going to do when you're standing in front of someone else who doesn't like what you're doing? If you're continuously seeking their acceptance, what good will all these laws be? If you don't accept who you are. Being bold doesn't mean being loud. It doesn't mean being arrogant. It doesn't mean being in your face. It can be very quiet and very humble. It's simply a person who knows how to stand with their feet planted firmly in their place. It's not with arrogance. It's not with yelling and screaming. It's simply by being through accepting. This is what the Mishnah means when it tells us to be bold as a leopard. This is what the first law in the Code of Jewish Law means when it tells us, do not be ashamed before those who are going to laugh at you. Judaism was founded on this characteristic. Abraham, the first Jew, is called Avraham HaIvri. Abraham the Ivri. Ivri means from the other side. The entire universe was worshiping idols. There was only one person that wasn't. Only one person that believed in a single God. And that was Abraham. Imagine standing up against the whole world with a different belief. This is what Abraham did. Because this is being bold as a leopard. This is a person who accepts who they are and stands with their feet planted firmly in their place. He didn't yell and scream. He was just very clear about who he was. And that created such an influence that most of the universe, most of the world today, believes in one God. And I speak about this now because with all of the recent events going on in the world, in our modern day and age, I have become inspired. I have become inspired to stand more boldly in my life and in my place, and to accept myself more than ever as a Jew. Because I only see support from everything going on in the world that acceptance from others is not something that can be waited for. And the answer is for me to accept myself. In 1972, the president of Israel requested from the ambassador of Israel to the United States, who was then Yitzhak Rabin, to please personally go and visit the Rebbe in honor of his birthday and wish him on behalf of the President of Israel a happy birthday. 1972, over 40 years ago. Yitzhak Rabin went for the very first time to meet the Rebbe in 1972. A very secular Israeli statesman with a great Hasidic leader. And in that conversation, amongst other things, the Rebbe asked Yitzhak Rabin if he feels lonely in Washington. And then he asked him why it is that the Jewish people are a lonely people. Is it because we choose to be lonely? Or is it because the world makes us lonely? And the Rebbe said, the destiny of the Jewish people is to be a lonely people. And we are alone in that. We choose to be who we are. We choose to adhere to the Torah and to its mitzvahs, to have faith in God. This has been the destiny of the Jewish people for all time. The ancient Philistines, the Babylonians, the Greeks, through the Inquisition, the expulsions, the pogroms, the Holocaust, was there a single day in Jewish history, a single day when the Jewish people did not stand alone? Because the Jewish people are destined to be a lonely people. This is our natural state, to walk alone in history, to pursue our own narrative, the narrative that God has laid out for us. The concept of the Jewish people seeking normalization amongst the nations defies our very identity, our very destiny in who we are. And the Rebbe told Yitzhak Rabin, you know who taught this to us? A Gentile taught this to us. The prophet Bilam in the book of Numbers, the Gentile prophet Bilam prophesied. And he said, Hey nam levadad yishkon, you will be a lonely nation, uva'agoyim lo yischashav, and amongst the other nations you will not be counted. The Gentile prophet that God sent to teach us that we must have the courage, we must be bold enough to step into our place in history. It's a lonely place. It's lonely to be an Abraham. But that is our destiny. And either we will eternally seek the acceptance of all of the nations around us, or we will begin to accept ourselves. Now, I thought to myself, imagine if I was eavesdropping on that conversation over 40 years ago. And I would think, the world is progressing. The world is becoming more open-minded, more liberal. I don't know, maybe in 40 years, maybe in 40 years, maybe, the world will begin to accept the Jewish people as they accept others. Maybe they will. I don't know if I can be so sure to say that this verse from over 3,300 years ago in the Torah is going to be true. But today, as we've progressed and the world claims to be more open-minded and more liberal, I am absolutely sure that this verse will remain true throughout the eternity of time until the coming of Mashiach. I know this will be true because if it's true today, over 40 years later, in our progressive modern era, I know that now the only answer we must all know is going to address what we're seeing happening in the world today is by us beginning to accept ourselves more and to stop seeking the acceptance of those around us. In May 2nd, 1935, a famous speech was given by Winston Churchill. He addressed the House of Commons, and here's just one quote from his speech. And he said, "The unwillingness to act when action will be simple and effective, the lack of clear thinking, the confusion of counsel until emergency comes, until self-preservation strikes its jarring gong, these are the features which constitute the endless repetition of history." What was Winston Churchill so wisely saying? We repeat history when we don't accept who we are. We repeat history when we don't accept what is. Let us simply accept who we are. We live in a weak world where there's so much weakness. A world that worships victimhood over responsibility. To lead, and this is true for any leader, to lead is to stand alone. We, the Jewish people, must be the moral compass, the divine compass of the universe, and that means to lead. And to lead, it means for me to know who I am, to stand firmly in my place, to accept myself, not to seek out the acceptance of others. Shouldn't a Jew feel comfortable praying? Shouldn't a Jew feel the need to study Torah? Shouldn't a Jew observe the Jewish holidays? Shouldn't every single one of us, beginning with myself, make sure that I study the 5 books of Moses, the gift that God has given to me as a Jew, from cover to cover? How else am I going to know who I am? How else am I going to be able to accept myself? The world is counting on us. The world is counting on us to be bold Jews. When we don't accept ourselves, when we don't make ourselves lonely, the world will make us lonely. That's what we see is happening. That's what we see has happened. Let us take our place in history and be the bold people that God wants us to be, that the other nations would like to see us be. Let us accept our place and stand there firmly. I want to conclude with a moving story I heard from the Jewish historian Rabbi Beryl Wein, who recounted an incident that happened when he was 11 years old in 1946, studying in a yeshiva in Chicago. In 1946, the chief rabbi of Israel was Rabbi Isaac Herzog. He came in 1946 to visit in Chicago. And he came to the yeshiva, of course, an appropriate place for a chief rabbi to visit, and he gave a 45-minute Talmudic discourse. And after the discourse, he told the rabbis in the yeshiva that he wants to speak with the boys. He wants to have a conversation with them. And this is what he told them. He said, "Boys, I just returned from visiting the Pope." He had just returned from the Vatican. He was coming from the Vatican to Chicago. And he said, "I gave the Pope a list of 10,000 names of Jewish children sequestered in Christian institutions during the war. And I asked the Pope to return the children. The Pope told me he could not do so because every child had been baptized, and he cannot return baptized children to be raised in another faith." And after Rabbi Herzog said this, the response of the Pope, he put his head down on the lectern. He put his head down, and he wept. He wept as if he was weeping for the entire history of the Jewish people. He sat there and wept. And then suddenly, he stood up. He stood up bold as a leopard. And this is what he said to the boys. He said, "There is nothing that I can do for those 10,000 children. There is nothing I can do for those 10,000 children. What are you going to do to build the Jewish people?" He asked us boys, what are you going to do to help build the Jewish people? This is the question that every single one of us needs to ask ourselves. What am I going to do to build the Jewish people? And I say to each and every one of us that now is the time for us to choose to accept ourselves, to accept who I am, to step boldly into my life, to stand firmly in my place, to be the Jew that God made me to be, and to let that identity grow and blossom so that we can be the moral and divine compass of the world.